Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm Zach Markowski. I've been spending a lot of time doing literary analysis and talks of poetry, and today we're on a journey, a revisitation to first principles, if you will, because what I have in my hands here is The Greek State by Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, which is titled here in the version I have as Preface to an Unwritten Book. So a fragment of an author's works. And it's only a few paragraphs. I'm thinking maybe doing one or two at a time because it is really dense. And when I say it's a revisitation to first principles, I mean not just the Greek state as understood as a military power, but also one as a civilization of actors and performers and writers, right? Because the new technology at the time was writing, the new medium was writing. Yes, people still spoke, people existed in the reality of the real world, but the technology of writing changed things, right? When you go from an oral culture with minimal or loose dreamlike interpretation of a mythology that was built up over time, paganism in this case, Greek paganism, which Nietzsche is going to get into, because like all good philosophers, again, upon revisiting first principles, people tend to think they know what means what. And even at his time in 1871, the Germans were very proud of what their understanding of classicism, let's say. And then Nietzsche reads Machiavelli, reads Plato, kind of sees that, oh, there's some things at odds here, right? So while everyone likes to say we have it figured out, we have our answers, be it religiously, scientifically, civilizationally, look, it's working, it's worked in the past, it'll work in the future. Nietzsche's saying, no, hold on, I see a problem here. And this is what all philosophers do. They generally, if they're worth anything, while there exists whole domains of thought and language where there's nothing new to say because it's already been communicated and it's already been communicated in mass to mass people, the philosopher is forever revisiting the obvious. Now, it might seem obvious that in Western culture, people make whole subject matters and productions of the obvious, but in the obvious is what's apparent. And what's apparent is what's hidden, or what becomes imminent, let's say, which we're going to get into. It's religious in nature. It's not just politics, it's also religion. So we moderns have an advantage over the Greeks in two ideas, which are given, as it were, as a compensation to a world behaving thoroughly slavishly, and yet at the same time anxiously eschewing the word slave. We talk about the dignity of man and the dignity of labor. Everybody worries in order miserably to perpetuate a miserable existence. This awful need compels man to consuming labor. He, or more exactly, the human intellect, seduced by the quote-unquote will, now occasionally marvels at labor as something dignified. However, in order that labor might have a claim on titles of honor, it would be necessary above all that existence itself, to which labor after all is only a painful means, should have more dignity and value than it appears to have had up to the present, to serious philosophies and religion. What else may we find in the labor need of all the millions but the impulse to exist at any price? The same all-powerful impulse by which stunted plants stretch their roots through earthless rocks. So I'm going to stop there because even this first paragraph, I could go on for probably an hour or two. But he's saying that modern man, in the first line, we moderns have an advantage over the Greeks in two ideas, given to a world, as it were, as a compensation to a world behaving thoroughly slavishly, yet anxiously eschewing the word slave. So he's talking about the use of language and morality to dress up the real situation, right? The dignity of labor, the dignity of man. What's dignified about work? I guess I'll get into the second paragraph here, and then it'll further kind of expand out. Out of this awful struggle for existence, only individuals can emerge, and they are at once occupied with noble phantoms of artistic culture, lest they should arrive at practical pessimism, which nature abhors as her exact opposite. Right? Nature doesn't like pessimism. It needs the will to overpower, is what he's saying. In the modern world, which compared with the Greeks usually produces only abnormalities and centaurs, in which the individual, like that fabulous creature in the beginning of the Horatian art of poetry, talking about Horace, is jumbled together out of pieces, here in the modern world, in one and the same man, the greed of the struggle for existence and the need for art show themselves at the same time. Out of this unnatural amalgamation has originated the dilemma to excuse and to consecrate the first greed before the need for art. Therefore, we believe in the dignity of man and the dignity of labor, which are artistic renditions and creations themselves. Because if you look at all of human history, the fact that slavery was the norm for all time through the majority of history, it's practically what defines human history and a lot of the human present too. So, in case you're wondering, Nietzsche defines slavery as anyone who doesn't have 2/3 of their day to themselves. And you can assume he might or might not include hours for sleep in there, but also the idea that whether it's discerning one's own duties, I think it's retaining one's own will for one's own work, one's own self. In context, in light of what he says in this, basically it's a self-preservative spirit. Other people can go fight the wars and dies, but the leader of the army is the one who's going to eventually hang in the background, right? Complete this disappearing act by way of Plato or Lord of the Rings, invisible ring of power. Um, and technically, it's not invisible. It gives you invisibility, but it is the ring of power. So the state is that binding agent. And to, again, start from the top, so we have an advantage that we can see with some perspective now. It's called the historic sense, right? The evolutionary sense. From there, we have these artistic phantoms. Everybody worries in order miserably to perpetuate a miserable existence, meaning people's own drive for life, their own will. This awful need compels, right, the will to survive, to endure, to procreate. This awful need compels man to consuming labor, i.e., once it was slavery, now it's capitalism. Slight shift there because people are slave to, regardless, a greater force, something beyond them, sheer necessity, and by that, voluntary and involuntary association with the cramp iron of the state, because no different than previous times, just like now, people exist, everyone exists with the invisible third party of the state as the extra member of the relationship who's just kind of forgotten about until they make an appearance if needed. And this happens all the time with how individuals and groups collide, fight, war, right? And the state is what binds all these mutually hostile forces. Nietzsche writes, however, in order that labor might have a claim on titles of honor, it would be necessary above all that existence itself, to which labor, after all, is only a painful means, right? Creating the tool, using the tool, working the tool, being worked or killed or destroyed by the tool happens all the time and every day for all history. Men have been disposable tools themselves, right? So it should have more dignity and value than it appears to have had up to the present to serious philosophies and religions. Right, look at the Greek gods. The last thing on their mind is work or labor or menial tasks. They have more important things to do, let's say. And then also curious here is man's relation to the gods and that chain that even happened in the first place. Because this is hilarious, because all of this, that need to both, the need is the technology to survive, and then the use and application of that technology through labor. So from there, we have to understand labor's place in the Greek pantheon. It had no place technically in the Greek pantheon. Duty, sacrifice, the representation of values, the waging of war, certain things very much had everything to do with the pantheon, the gods, aka the aristocrats. But technology itself actually came from Hephaestus, right? After different versions of the story goes, either he was, the funniest version goes that Hera thought he was ugly, so threw him off, right? Threw him off of Mount Olympus, said, "You're too ugly to be a god." And there goes his fall. He landed on, was it Lemnos, the island, was nurtured by sea goddesses, eventually learned metallurgy to work with technology. And the thing about technology is, why is he doing this? Well, in other versions of the story, he was born lame or a crippled. And I don't know if those words are politically correct anymore, but Nietzsche would say that political correctness itself is a tool of the state. Political correctness is the drones of culture at work. It's technically, there's nothing wrong with it, right? It's the drones of a state doing as the state instinct has them blinded to do, right? They're just doing as they're supposed to. They're technically being good citizens, right? If someone is following the laws and the mandates, whether that's the same or changing, technically they see themselves as just, right? They see their wielding of power as just. But in this case, whether this God was faulty or he was seen as ugly or whatever it was, basically wounded for life, starts developing technology, and technology is understood as the evoking of demons, not the invoking, which is a passive state, supposedly, right? The meaning of the word. But evoking is calling upon, right? The calling upon of daemonia. And I hope people aren't interpreting this in a superstitious or a Christian sense. This is pagan understanding of the world. This was wisdom. This was the rule of the gods. What's ugly and unnecessary is cast aside. It's looked past. It's not just, you don't build statues to it. You don't make it the subject of your art. You cast it out of the mountain. In other more modern versions, I think Hephaestus lives underground. But isn't it telling that both the crippled ugly god, as well as the only one who needs and creates and is relying upon technology, basically, right? And I know within other stories you could argue that the gods are always kind of enacting these creative forces, but that's the point. Is it's a different type of creative force, one in which evokes powers outside of oneself, the powers that be, the immanent powers, right? So in this case, he's gone off the mountain, he's hidden away. And then we haven't even gotten to man's relation to the gods. And that's to say that it wasn't until Prometheus came along and stole fire from Hephaestus and then brought it back to man and taught him how to make fire, to which he was punished for eternity. Everyone knows, most everyone, well, I guess somewhat literate people at least know the story that, for stealing the fire, he was chained to a rock, forced to watch 8 hours of reality TV a day, upon which he died, and then was resurrected every morning to repeat this horrible cycle forever. So you can see that man's position is far away and removed. It's beneath even the god of Techne. It's beneath even, so in this case, the tools almost do hold a position higher than him, as well as the process itself, because it's creative. It's being subject to an immanent will or power or force, all of which the Greek aristocrats were forever trying to, you could say in some sense, in their acting, in their theater, in their idealism, and in Platonism at least, in Socratism in a very real sense, as well as their obsession with mathematics, was the stripping away of these artistic veils. It's part of why Plato inevitably banishes the poets, of which we're going to get into, which Nietzsche points out seems to be a remnant of his teacher Socrates, because, and I guess you could question it out, which we'll never have an answer for, because unless it's written down somewhere and it could be attributed, then the thought would be that without Socrates there to influence his student for better or worse, would the thought have occurred naturally to Plato himself, or would he saw it as a way to make money? Because translating it to modern day civilization, you can see how like something like a government PSA, public broadcasting, all these sorts of mediums are Platonic ideals. From Sesame Street to Dare, right? Certain memes like don't do drugs, all of these things relate to Platonic idealism that a state, a higher power, is enacting on its people, right? These laws and customs that it's constantly enforcing. So uh, Nietzsche is saying that notice how philosophy and religion has nothing to do with manual labor. It hardly has anything to do with even the tools of labor or the tools created by the thinking labor or the feeling labor, i.e. art. So philosophy, religion, which is what carried so much, which carried all of our artistic meaning in the beginning, because what other things inspired us in a world that was already terrible and beyond us, right, is already recognized here upon the Greeks. This pessimism, right, arriving at the next part of the story here, right? What else may we find in the labor need of the millions but the impulse to exist at any price? This has been the story of history. Existence at any price. They'll squander, like you see that civilizations squander and destroy themselves through civil war and otherwise before they ever come to a historically reasonable conclusion. This is all of Western history, right? You can bide time, but it's all a deferral. It's all a deferral of the real powers and violence at work. So And he's saying the same all-powerful impulse which stunted plants stretched their roots through earthless rocks. And I could point out that this idealism, the mathematics, all of it has been at work all along. It was all in a hurry to get here. And now that we're here, where else is there to go? Where do people still think there is to go? As Nietzsche writes elsewhere, if the world and man and life and the universe had a purpose or an ultimate goal, there's no reason it wouldn't have already reached it yet, right? There's no rationality to a preset time frame or one that's already concluded, even though all of this is seen as fated, which is why it exists in the power in the realms of philosophy and religion, which is to say, the God's understanding, the aristocratic understanding, the difference between master and slave, and that all of history has been a conditioning of these conditions, which I think, as I've stated before, is based on personality type and also intelligence within these different personality types, because there's certainly certain personality types are rarer than others, but at the same time, just because something's rare doesn't mean it's a pinnacle or it's at its peak or that it's even desirable. It just means it's rare, right? Um, what we see of everything beneath the gods, including technology, including the invoking of demons, of knowledge and spirits to create, right? Because Hephaestus is also the god of not just metallurgy, but crafts, art, skills. All of this is shameful. All of this is actually beneath the gods. Even in a culture like, bringing it back to the modern sense, like in America, right? We imitate classicism, we imitate the Romans, we imitate everything. We have constant revivals. We constantly recycle classicism and all these other phases of history too. In fact, with the internet, with the global savage tribal village, we actually reinvented tribal history. So now we see a world of people existing alongside each other, literate, semi-literate, illiterate, right? Preach, and then also tribal societies still alive in the world who haven't fully adopted the Western world model because frankly, they just don't fit into, the model notion of time, which essentially doesn't mean anything anymore. With the death of religion and gods, and even something like science is the savior, that there's some, again, future state that's going to deliver us, when all of it has been a power struggle and a squandering. Now, no doubt, the technology we've been developing has been the end result of everyone through all time kind of building up this stratum of civilization over time till we've created a light speed network of communication. People are still trying to figure out what it means, why, what they can do with it. Nietzsche is going to tell you what people are really up to and why as this essay goes on. But in the meantime, we're just looking and look at these modern inventions of dignity, of man and labor. In the past, you can see the religions and philosophies themselves understood work wasn't an aim or a goal or something good in and of itself. And that when you run out of a culture's purpose or meaning, once you get outside of the realms of art, i.e. the realms of religion and philosophy, once you move away from both idealism, even if it's the idealism of the gods, right? We uphold the beautiful, we cast out the ugly, we select and deselect for that which we value. Um, things start going downhill really quickly. To by the time you're chained to a rock, having your liver eaten for eternity, or you're rolling a rock uphill and the rock rolls down at the bottom of the hill every day, right? But he's saying that, the plants break through these rocks. So, and what he's talking about is the state as nature's means to development and creation of the genius, because without these infinitely larger forces and powers constantly bearing down everyone's time, attention, and mind to one direction in a violent and coercive manner, without that, there would be no development of strength as in the state, outside the state, counterbalance, use and abuse, whatever the powers at work may be. So out of this awful struggle for existence, only individuals can emerge. This is what I'm saying, right? From the drones of culture, from all the people saying and doing and imitating the same things, they are once occupied with the noble phantoms of artistic culture. Think of the Buddha. The Buddha was royalty. It took him to the age of 30 to realize, oh, culture is a made-up story. He came to nihilism. He went out seeking, trying to understand, basically comes to realize at the end of culture's rope is nihilism, and past that you have to create something yourself, or you're just going to languish and die, and it's a will to nothingness. So that's what Nietzsche's talking about, that the Greeks recognized this and everywhere overcame it in their arts. The Hellenistic age was a tragedy. It wasn't written as a comedy until Plato came along. And then Christianity followed up and said, you know what? Mortal life and soul for everyone. We're going to erase distance. We're going to erase difference. Even Hephaestus can join the gods. Here's this lame god who exists and does everything beneath the gods. Even he has a place in the heavenly Mount Olympus realms, right? Nietzsche saying this is not the case and it's never been the case. So out of this struggle for existence, only individuals can emerge, and they're at once occupied, okay, lest they should arrive at practical pessimism, right? Quote Selinus, better to have never been born at all. So like modern notions of pessimism, Schopenhauerianism, even guys like Thomas Ligotti, I have him on the shelf here, the book Conspiracy Against the Human Race, which is modern philosophical pessimism, which is also postmodern itself, which is also basically even in Buddhism. Buddhism has its own element of post-history. It just exists in a different culture, different people, different physiologies, and also the very nature of Hindu allows for contraposition, just like Buddhism allows for contraposition of Hinduism. They just, make each other subservient to each other. So in Buddhism, the gods serve the Buddha and say, oh, what a revelation, us gods didn't even know this, right? It sounds like an aristocrat speaking, someone who knows what they're talking about, right? How to get others on board. And then from there, within Hinduism, he becomes the 13th avatar of Vishnu. So this is also like within Greece, right? Understand that like any point in time, I don't think the boundaries are ever as clear as any essay or history will ever make them, because there's something to be said of Hellenistic syncretism that, and he questions that here too, by the way, but that, throughout time, all cultures and people have kind of blended together a little bit, taken and given ideas and beliefs and understandings, whether it's medicinal, technological, right? It's all kind of learned and copied from one another. And sometimes cultures borrow from other cultures. This has happened through all history, right? To this day, we use Arabic numerals, for instance. The Arab world, who basically held on to Aristotle and gave it back to us after our dark ages, which all of these are misinterpretations of history, because while in one culture, even if it eventually became a worldwide dominant culture, even then, there's always history happening everywhere else. So while all of history becomes constrained to a single battlefield that does or doesn't lead to an empire's decline, ascendancy or descendancy, everywhere else in the world, the birds are chirping. Life goes on. Man and woman are living, loving, hating, creating, doing all sorts of Hephaestian deeds, engaging in Promethean behavior, engaging in aristocratic behavior. Moving on here, though, in the modern world, which compared with the Greek usually produces only abnormalities and centaurs, he's saying the Greeks did reach a state of perfection and idealism that they couldn't even appreciate from having a lack of perspective in history to even draw upon. But they basically created the model that everyone else has been chasing ever since. At least in the Western world, and with how Christianity kind of attached itself to classicism, in which the individual, which originally it was against, because it was against the Roman Empire and it was against the church and it was against the Jews, right? I could go on and on about how complicated this all is. So which compared with the Greeks usually produces only abnormalities and centaurs. Another way might just be saying bad art, in which the individual, like the fabulous creature in the beginning of the Horatian art of poetry, I mentioned this. This is the year 19 BC, Horace's Ars Poetica, where he writes of the way an individual should, come to their style and appreciation and understanding, so as to create beautiful poetry. I'll pull it up right here. I have it on the Wikipedia, so if you want to look, Horace's Ars Poetica. It's The Art of Poetry is a poem written by Horace circa 19 BC, in which he advises poets on the art of writing poetry and drama. The Ars Poetica has exercised a great influence in later ages on European literature, notably on French drama, and has inspired poets and authors since it was written. Although it has been well known since the Middle Ages, it has been used in literary criticism since the Renaissance. And let's see, they have a summary of the maxims here. A, B, and C. Pretty good, right? Down to threes. A poem demands unity to be secured by harmony and proportion, as well as a wise choice of subject and good diction. Meter and style must be appropriate to theme and character. A good model will always be found in Homer. Right, so the Greeks saying, we like what we do, right? This is a culture, and basically saying that he created the model. and then culture becomes about recreating and then reinterpreting the model, and with novelty, right? It's history is actually a game of novelty that is change and flux over time, despite its eternally recurrent nature. So B, dramatic poetry calls for special care as to characters, drawing, propriety of representation, length of a play, number of actors, use of the chorus in its music, especially features of this satiric type, verse forms, and employment of Greek models. And then C, a poet's qualifications include common sense, knowledge of character, adherence to high ideals, intellectual superiority, appreciation of the noble history and lofty mission of poetry, and above all, a willingness to listen and to profit by impartial criticism, right? To understand, to be open to, because without a certain requisite openness, you actually won't have any new art to offer, any new culture to offer, anything new at all, anything novel to offer, right? Things begin to solidify. This is where institutions come in. It's through the solidification, stagnation, those institutions basically become the rocks through which individuals are formed by breaking through the barriers around them. Because the very notion of any kind of freedom, right? The idea of escape, the gods are the closest thing to being free from this mortal condition, yet see how they're human, all too human, all the same, it kind of goes in this direction. And then with this idea at the beginning of Horatio's Art of Poetry, I said this in the video on welcoming poetry submissions on the channel, is that it is something personal, and it is an interim step between an individual character, an individual experience, an individual fiction, an individual drama, to one an audience can better share in and understand. So it ranges from a form of psychology on one hand to art and beyond on another, a mapping of the world, a mapping of the self. And then within that, there should be a reflection of reality. So back to art of philosophy and religion, right? Look at how it's reflected here. Look at man's relation to technology and fire. Look at that relationship to Hephaestus. Look at Hephaestus's relationship to the gods, Hephaestus's relationship to technology, which is again the evocation of demons, the calling down of forces and spirits to make use of materials in the real world, the almost like from where the heavenly realm on high, which was imagined, threw down its reality, which the Greeks and their culture themselves utterly rejected. What they appreciated was the end result. They enjoyed the fruits of the end results, which was this civilization, this culture of artists and actors who nothing was mass manufactured. Everything was crafted, was handcrafted, had different limited tools, yet we were still very powerful with far less people, far less manpower than the sort of institutions and goods and services we see manufactured today. They did all of that too, and they did it in a much harsher world under much different circumstances, and they stood up brave in the tragedy regardless. They didn't need well, technically they invented and perfected the comedy. If you look at most modern comedies, you'll see that they've been copying it ever since. My initial thought the very first time I read this, the Horatian Art of Poetry, I did understand it to be the way the artist, the poet, the individual comports and styles themselves, and not just charisma, but character, and thus how that affects their art. So it is a matter of good taste. In case anyone is wondering, everything in life relates back to an individual's taste. I get it, there's a lot of necessity, there's a lot of blunt force trauma, but at the same time, I guarantee you most people, if they can even afford to be honest with themselves about themselves, they would recognize that every problem in their life related to poor taste in intellectual food, real food, and people. Associations, the few that might actually be something like voluntary or desired even sometimes, right? But maybe that's kind of the point of what's imminent, is it's a learning experience, and it's individual. The individual's education, just like the individual's art, is not actually given by an institution or by other people. And Nietzsche's kind of pointing this out, right? That is the creation of genius, is the breaking forth and the breaking through. Otherwise, everyone would be doing the same thing, and that's imitating whoever their cultural heroes are and mouthing whatever the values or the words are. Because remember, all present arts and mediums go back to the oldest, which is writing, which is talking, right? Which is reality. So, pieces here in the modern world, in the same man, the greed of the struggle for existence and the need for art show themselves at the same time. One appropriates and uses the other, right? Out of this unnatural amalgamation has originated the dilemma to excuse and to consecrate the first greed before the need for art, right? That slavery, that slavery, the involuntary life upon the masses, basically, the involuntary power forever coercing the masses, whether that's in the future AI or in the present cops, laws, governments, blah, 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 right? Just social enforcement mechanisms amongst people themselves, concepts like the Overton window that kind of define what's an acceptable versus outside the window crazy point of view and perspective and perception to even bring to bear on any given situation, whether it's seen as reasonable and understood or not. So, so they show themselves at the same time. Immediately, those with power set to appropriate those without power to their ends, is what he's saying. To excuse and to consecrate that first greed before the need for art, right? At the end of the day, it's what the people in charge want. It's what power wants. That's how civilization, philosophy, religion, and art is all created. You can think in other terms. In modern times, just like all times, generally we get the masses get the art the oligarchs are willing to fund. That doesn't mean there's individual genius artists who aren't working. It just means they're overshadowed by what's popular, what's funded, what's available for the masses. So in the modern times, if that's like NFTs and crypto and bad AI and bad social media and a lot of dead internet space, that's just what we have on offer. It speaks to the values of the time, which is the need for the art, which is the need to make money and survive, right? Art was reappropriated to capitalistic purposes. In case people are confused, capitalists are the middlemen of history. It's somewhere between pirate and post-human or superhuman. You have the capitalists, and basically, as modern aristocrats, they don't make or create anything themselves generally. They are the heads at the binding agent of everyone else's labor, time, and art. So they don't create anything themselves. They make money off other people's resources and time and wealth, right? It's almost like there's some interim between the crippled god Hephaestus and Zeus, right? He who has the gold makes the rule. He who throws the lightning bolts makes the rules, right? You could look at it through many different kind of perceptions, but it's all that of power, immutable, indomitable, binding power, right? That has the power to select and deselect, to elevate and de-elevate. Um, so I think rounding out our exploration of these first two paragraphs of Nietzsche's The Greek State, whether it's slavery or capitalism, that it winds up being the same form of intelligent and stronger life feeding off the prey-like weaker life, right? That for all of history, those at the bottom are kept at the bottom. It's all about not letting the moment powers and social forces change, immediately we have to reorganize a bit, but that happens and then it's back to business as usual, right? And now that we're here, I'm seeing that the video is already on to almost 40 minutes. And as I said, these are only the first two paragraphs. Again, this has been Nietzsche's The Greek State, Preface to an Unwritten Book, 1871. Thanks again for checking out the channel. Please like, share, subscribe. Share it with people if you think they'd appreciate it. Hit the notification bell button. It'll tell you when new uploads come. From there, I'm going to resume in the next few videos with more of the Greek State. And eventually, as I mentioned before, I'll get to Emerson's Self-Reliance, and then with more content, including your submitted poetry. So if you didn't see this before, but you're seeing it now, again, I have a poetry submission open to the channel. Maybe I'll leave a link below, but also you can find the video on the channel. If we're both fortunate enough to be here tomorrow, we'll catch each other then. Take care.